Hello students, I just wanted to check in with you about the Friday forums. I wanted to say that I'm very impressed so far with the responses, and this is working exactly as I hoped it would work, because when we do these background readings in class, it's usually something where students will read it, and then we'll have some time, 20, 30 minutes in class, where we'll have an opportunity to have a discussion, which is one of the great things about being in a classroom. And the whole point of the background readings like this, I think I mentioned this in my notes at some point. Last spring, when we had worked on this course, we had focused on issues related to the American Indian Reservation to the north of us at Pine Ridge, and some of the socioeconomic challenges in our own region. And so we read books that were relevant to that topic. We read a book called On the Res by Ian Fraser, and the articles, and there's a folder of these materials that are posted in resources left over from that semester. So that was the point of that, was to have a real working example for us to look at in the background of people that are going through difficult times, or they need help. And as being an English professor teaching literature, that's one of the parts of the course that I like to bring into it, and part of the interdisciplinary nature of the FYI outcome to begin with. So I know that it is a challenge to be reading so much material in a short span of time, but I'm impressed so far with the forums. You guys have done a nice job of coming in here. You posted your questions that you needed to post before the deadline last week, before Friday. You got your questions posted, most of you. We've got good activity, and here it is Thursday, and the majority of the class has responded already to the questions. And like I said, they've been really excellent questions. I don't have any really sort of feedback on this. You guys are doing a nice job of framing sort of broader questions that come from the reading, as well as that are set specifically in elements of the reading. Most of you are following the instructions of trying to sort of have interspersed questions, so that we have some readings from the first, some questions that are focused on the first part, some questions that are focused on the second part, and then in the responses, you guys are doing a nice job. I will say, remember that your responses, you need to respond to at least two of your classmates' questions, two separate classmates, two separate questions, and those responses are worth 10 points each, so you want to make sure that, so they're weighted a little bit more, so you want to make sure that they take into consideration the question and respond as fully as possible, with the goal illustrating that you have read critically and carefully, and that you have some thoughts to share. And if you can connect it back to our course and what we're doing, that would be great as well. I did want to just chime in a little bit on what's going on in the reading that I think is interesting. One of the reasons why we selected this book was because, even though none of us, well, I don't know how many students are from sort of more of an urban setting, but this obviously is set in two worlds that are completely far removed from me, and probably pretty far removed from most of you. The world of sort of the Ivy League, this New Haven, Connecticut, Yale campus, that sort of stuff, and this world of the inner city in Newark, two areas which I have no familiarity with at all. And so the goal, I think what is nice about this book in regards to our course, is that it has the perspective of the author, who comes from one sort of context and background, and the subject, Robert Peace, who comes from a completely different set of context. And it fits in nicely with some of the elements we've been reading in the Service Learning textbook. Chapter 4 for today, which is part of our lesson number 6, goes into this discussion about how we, when working with groups and collaborating with others, if we always just got along, there'd be no problem. But the thing is, with service and volunteer work and collaboration and groups, that we don't always get along, and sometimes it's hard to know where somebody's coming from. People do things that frustrate us, they do things differently than we would do them, and so it's helpful to know some of their background and some of the, as chapter 4 puts it, the attribution. Do we know what's going on in that person's head? Do we know what's going on in that person's life? Do we have empathy with the fact that if somebody cuts us off in traffic or is going really slow down the freeway or something, maybe, maybe think about that being your grandparent or something instead of getting all frustrated. What sort of empathy do we have towards what's going on in their lives? You don't know the battles people are fighting in the background and what they present in a public space, and sometimes that's a hard lesson to learn. So I thought that this passage from the reading that's due for this Friday made some sense to me. This is on page 152, and there's this scene that Rob Peace is holed up in his room, and he's upset because he's been mistreated in the cafeteria, and he's kind of sulking about this. And this is what the character Hobbs, the narrator, says about this moment. And I think it has a nice thematic overview of the book and why I'm asking you to read it and respond to it in these Friday forums. He says, you can't do that, Rob. You can't go and beat up these kids who are on the crew team because they didn't bust their trays. And he looked at me chagrined, his face saying, why the hell not? My answer, I mean, you just can't. I know, he finally said. What, you thought I was serious? In fact, I had known he was. I was still struggling to equate the irritating but unremarkable encounter he described, because it wasn't important to the narrator. It didn't seem that big a deal to the narrator. But he's trying to get into the head of Robert Peace and see how it must be from his perspective. I had doubtlessly forgotten to bust my own tray once or twice, though I didn't admit that now. With the profound anger still coursing through him, a few hours and a few joints later. It's not clear why is he so upset. But if we start to understand the background and the socioeconomic forces that he grew up in, maybe these actions make a little more sense. I felt guilty for being unable to do so, for lacking the empathy required to connect a careless prep school slight to a fundamental flaw in the social construct in which we lived. All I said was, that sucks, dude. He shook his head and smiled for the first time that night, a smile approaching the broad, remarkable grin that had come to characterize him on campus. He knew I could never understand, and he was kind enough not to hold my sheltered obliviousness against me. This had become the rhythm of our relationship at Yale. He would share with me the smallest fragment of his world and then step back into the whole of mine. We watched the movie Cinematic Fight, a murdered ninja sensei being avenged by his protege. My mind drifted back to my English paper and the track meet this weekend and some girl who wasn't emailing me back. His mind went somewhere else, a place I couldn't access, a struggle rooted in a youth he never spoke of, a struggle he seemed to feel with a possessiveness closely related to pride, was his alone to bear. So I hope you're picking up on that in the book, these twin perspectives on the lives that these folks have lived. And it speaks a little bit to the current political climate and social climate that we live in, this Black Lives Matters movement, the Occupy Wall Street. Sometimes we get frustrated and we can't understand, why are those people so upset about this or that other thing? You're not a part of that group and you don't understand. And maybe you even get frustrated and you maybe belittle it, or you think that, gee, man, they're making a lot of fuss over nothing. And I hope this book shows that when you come from a background that is different than the context in this sort of Yale context, someone not bussing their trays and disrespecting you in that way, out of obliviousness, I don't think those students are trying to be particularly mean-spirited or racist or whatever. It just shows how there are two different perspectives and two different worlds that are colliding there, and that contributes in some ways to the challenges we have in going forward when we have folks from different perspectives trying to work together. And I think we see this in service work, we see this in group work, we see this in college classrooms when we're trying to get to know each other and have some empathy and understanding of each other's backgrounds. I hope that this book is bringing some of that to the surface. So again, good work on the Friday forums. Keep doing what you're doing. I appreciate your hard work. I know that it is a lot of work, but I hope this background reading will lend something to our course in the meantime as we're going through our own service projects.